First, I would like to thank all of you for having us here today. The affirmative's panacea is counterproductive and unrealistic. We obviously agree that it's of vital importance to take action against climate change, but fundamentally disagree on the way that those responsibilities should be allocated. Any obligation on behalf of developing countries is too much obligation. Climate change conversations cannot ignore social justice and equality, or else we will just reproduce the same schemes that cause environmental destruction now. Developing countries should not have an obligation that rightfully belongs to developed countries. A requirement where developing countries have to have responsibility for global warming sets up a system overall where developing countries are responsible for the excesses of developed countries in general. This is another instance of the colonial forces that allow developed Western countries to determine the action of developing countries even when they, at the roots, were the causes. It also has a harmful effect in terms of addressing other environmental harms. It's very easy for us to say in the incredibly safe confines of the French Consulate that if we address global warming, down the line, that will somehow help us with disease. It's a very different reality on the ground in many countries where air pollution makes it difficult to go outside and water quality is terrible. Even if in the longer term addressing global warming is sufficient, in the short term, these countries need to do triage on the health crises, and any other type of obligation necessarily trades off with the type of immediate help that is necessary. Finally, it prevents the type of economic development that is necessary for a long-term and sustainable solution to climate. As long as countries are economically undeveloped, they have an incentive to continue in high carbon use industries, such as logging, forestry, and agriculture. Even if switching to a manufacturing-based economy in the short term causes more emissions, in the long term it is what's necessary to reduce them. The Kuznets curve, for instance, demonstrates that as countries become more economically self-sufficient, their emissions go down naturally. This means that over the long term, a strategy which prioritizes economic development should be sufficient on its own. And Professor Schelling, from our earlier speech, demonstrates that climate change can be addressed in developing countries without determining their own obligation. For instance, developed countries can provide climate aid in the form of carbon-efficient technology. Their example about how Germany is developing solar power is an argument for us because it proves that if only developed countries are forced to have an obligation, they provide the technology, they maintain the economies of scale, they get production costs lower to the point where it's economically feasible for developing countries to use it, and indeed it's in their self-interest. Additionally, developed countries must bear all costs for addressing climate change because it's impossible to gain support in developing countries for preventative measures that harm their economies. This means that the affirmative is fundamentally a pipe dream. Here I'll quote Joseph Stiglitz, the winner of the Nobel Prize in Economics. Any agreement has to be crafted in such a way that it does not adversely affect growth and poverty alleviation within the developing world. It would be hard for any developing country to muster support for an agreement that was perceived to put their development agenda in jeopardy. The cost of mitigation ought to be borne by the developed countries, and the developed countries ought to help the developing countries with the cost of adaptation. Resources devoted to limiting emissions or to adapting climate change are resources that could have been spent reducing poverty or promoting growth. Now, there are obviously places of convergence, but the question is what approach leads to a more just and economically sound future, because in the end, both sides are trying to reduce suffering over the longer term. They make an argument about how they allow different solutions and different paths within this form of obligation, but what gets sold as a reasonable approach is consistent with the West getting what is convenient for them and not what is best for the world. They have zero guarantee developing countries will provide foreign aid. It's an easy promise to make at this point. Ahmad gives examples of carbon trading schemes that have empirically led to Western domination, such as in Uganda, when there was a claim and a request on behalf of Western countries to cause reforesting that was supposed to be largely the responsibility of Western countries. In the end, it ended up harming the economy of Uganda and forcing people off of their land in order to have reforesting schemes that were not consistent with local needs. Their continued insistence on the high emissions from developing countries is also a demonstration of the way their obligations would be implemented. The differentiated principle of solar in one country and wind in another is a laughable false choice that prevents meaningful solutions in terms of economic development, and it still maintains the problematic balance of power where Western countries dictate what occurs in less developed countries. Any resources that are spent in terms of producing climate change at this point, before countries are able to do their triage, are wasted resources. They make an argument about how there are differences in countries like China and India, and how countries like China are doing warming reduction goals, etc. This is the best possible proof of our argument, because it's a question of sequencing. China at this point has a sufficient amount of economic growth to begin dealing with emissions reductions, etc. Our approach allows developing countries to decide for themselves when they should take action to stop emissions and when they should take action in order to stop more immediate problems like water pollution, air pollution, and economic development, etc. Which demonstrates that after the economy is stronger, countries will undertake these on their own as they said, it's in those countries' self-interest. Thank you.
Excellent. 1 second, sorry. Alright. So if countries have the if countries have like the obligation to protect their citizens from disease, pollution, and climate change makes that really worse for them, why don't they have this obligation to also prevent like some of the effects of climate change?
Well, I think this is a kind of a perfect demonstration of a mistaken assumption you have, which is that there is no way to address climate change without developing countries having an obligation. We would argue that developed countries alone having an obligation will inevitably trickle down to developing countries in terms of both technology, economic resources, as well as the strength of a country necessary to undertake large action. It also presupposes that it's possible or even desirable to have action in developing countries for emissions reductions, but we have read evidence that there is no developing country who would ever agree to emissions reductions now.
No developing country. So why has
Right.
China? So I mean, your entire example of China, like they've clearly already done so. Right?
I should have qualified that with international emissions regulations. So our evidence speaks to how there is no possible international agreement. Joseph Stiglitz writes that there is no possible international agreement signed onto by developing countries, that they are uninterested in holding themselves to the same obligation as the West, and even if it's incorrect, they perceive that any international agreement would necessarily harm their growth.
Then why is it the case that 190 countries signed on to the Lima Agreement?
I'm not familiar necessarily with the Lima Agreement, but I would argue that it doesn't place the same type of obligation on states that the strict adherence that you continue to say is important.
Well, we're not necessarily saying that we have to like set this like strict standard, but we are saying that.
You are.
Well, okay. Well, we are saying. Well, the resolution only says that there is an obligation, and we're just saying strict adherence simply means that you shouldn't cheat if there is an obligation.
Right, and we are saying that having any obligation, internationally determined, necessarily prevents developing countries from attaining the type of growth that is necessary for a longer-term sustainable solution.
Why? It's like, why can't they do triage with like more sustainable forms of energy? Maybe they have to use fossil fuels, but why can't they have to keep an eye on the future? Why do they not have to?
This is the kind of Western centrism that plagues most of your arguments. So having solar power in a country like Germany and having solar power in a country like Uganda is very different in terms of the economic infrastructure that already exists. Uganda might not have the same type of mechanical engineer PhDs, the same raw materials. It might have much higher transportation costs to get high-tech goods there, etc. Which means that your claim that, why don't they just use solar, is a little laughable.
I mean, solar power might or might not be a good idea for Uganda, just like it might or might not be a good idea for South Africa or any other country. But insofar as we can, insofar as we, there's debate on that, but insofar as we can find some like sustainable energy plan, don't they have an obligation to find a way? I mean, I'm not sure like what trade-offs you've shown in today's debate so far. So.
Our evidence speaks to general trade-offs in terms of resources and attention.